The Pudding Predicament. Gather round because I'm about to spill the beans, or should I say the pudding, on what went down at the Great Wibbleton Pudding Contest. This isn't just any dessert debacle. It's a tale filled with culinary ambition, a floating fiasco, and a village where pudding is practically a competitive sport. Bob, the resident mad scientist of Wibbleton, with a degree from the University of Unusual Ideas, had a history of hilarious inventions. There was the battery-operated battery charger, which no one talked about, and the comb for bald heads, which didn't exactly fly off the shelves. This year, Bob decided that the pudding world needed a shake-up, or a float-up, if you will. His groundbreaking idea? Helium-infused pudding. After weeks of whipping up chaos in his kitchen, which now looked like a mad scientist's lab with pots and pans clanging like cymbals in an orchestra, Bob unveiled his concoction. He had managed to infuse just the right amount of helium into his pudding, encasing it in a transparent, airtight container that made it resemble a culinary spaceship more than a dessert. Imagine a pudding, proud and dignified, floating like a blimp at a football game. On the day of the contest, Bob strutted into the town square, his pudding bobbing along in the air like it was on parade. The townsfolk couldn't believe their eyes. Kids pointed and giggled, dogs barked in bemusement, and a cat tried to jump and catch it, thinking perhaps it was a very plump, very slow bird. But just as Bob preened, ready to bask in his impending glory, fate and a mischievous breeze had other plans. A gust of wind, playful as a puppy on a windy day, swept through the square. In a moment that seemed to slow down for maximum comedic effect, Bob's pudding container slipped from his fingers, floated out of reach, and began its ascent over Wibbleton like a dessert-themed UFO. Bob, in a frenzy as frantic as a cat on a hot tin roof, dashed after it with a parade of townsfolk in tow, turning the event into a spectacle that was part chase scene, part slapstick comedy. And so, with the pudding making its escape and Bob in hot pursuit, the stage was set for an afternoon of uproarious chaos and aerial dessert rescue missions that would go down in Wibbleton history. Word of Bob's miraculous floating pudding spread like wildfire, or perhaps more appropriately, like whipped cream on a hot pie. It wasn't long before folks from neighbouring towns were flocking to Wibbleton. They came in droves, drawn not only by tales of a dessert that defied the laws of physics, but by a curiosity to see this culinary wonder for themselves. Bob, never one to miss an opportunity, decided it was high time to capitalise on his newfound fame. He set up a whimsical booth right in the heart of the town square, dubbing it Bob's Levitational Delights. The booth was adorned with banners that fluttered in the breeze, each one depicting cartoonish puddings with smiley faces soaring among clouds. Bob sold miniature versions of his floating pudding, which he cleverly packaged in little helium-filled balloons that customers had to pop open to enjoy. These treats were quite the spectacle. If you didn't hold them down with a spoon, they'd float right off your plate and into the sky, much to the delight of children and the occasional perplexed pigeon. One sunny afternoon, a mischievous youngster named Timmy decided to stir up some trouble. He purchased one of Bob's floating puddings, untied the string that anchored it to a tiny weighted plate, and, with a giggle, released it into the air. The pudding soared upwards, drifting with the whims of the breeze, its ascent only halted by an unexpected encounter with a street sign marking a no-parking zone. The spectacle caught the eye of Mr. Grumble, the town's notoriously stern traffic warden. Mr. Grumble, whose name suited his disposition perfectly, was not amused by the aerial antics of a renegade dessert. He marched over, clipboard in hand, and after scrutinizing the floating pudding as it bobbed innocently against the sign, he did the only thing that made sense in his rule-loving mind. He wrote a parking ticket. With a furrowed brow and a grumpy mutter, Mr. Grumble stuck the ticket onto the closest solid surface he could find, the string of the balloon and shook his head in disbelief. "No parking means no parking," he declared to the chuckling onlookers, "whether you're a Ford or a Flan." The image of Mr. Grumble ticketing a pudding was so absurdly hilarious that it not only made the front page of the local newspaper, but also went viral online. People far and wide shared the photo, captioning it with puns and jokes about deserted vehicles and sweet spots. Bob's floating pudding had not only lifted deserts into the air, but also the imaginations of every Wibbletonian. The town was abuzz with helium-infused innovations that turned every meal into a potential aerial event. At the local diner, helium donuts became the latest craze. These sugary delights bobbed just above head height, requiring patrons to perform a sort of gastronomic leapfrog, jumping up and snapping their mouths shut around the floating treats. The spectacle was half breakfast service, half comedy show, drawing crowds who were as keen to laugh as they were to nibble. Meanwhile, at Jerry's Deli, the sandwiches got the helium treatment too. These buoyant buns proved quite the handful, as they tended to float away if not properly anchored. Jerry, ever the problem solver, began tying them down with little string weights, much like you'd tether a balloon at a child's party. Customers would select a sandwich, then carefully untie it from the counter, holding tightly to their roast beef or turkey club as if walking a particularly floaty pet. However, the pinnacle of this helium hysteria came during the annual Wibbleton parade. This year, alongside the floats and marching bands, the parade featured an entry from Marge's country kitchen, a giant helium-filled meatloaf sculpted to look like a cow. Marge, proud of her airy beef, had perhaps gone a bit too far with the helium. Midway through the parade, just as the meatloaf was passing the judge's stand, the strings securing it snapped. The meatloaf took off like a savory rocket, ascending swiftly with an undignified squelch. It floated higher and higher, eventually drifting over the town like a bizarre, gravy-scented UFO. The crowd's initial shock turned to amusement as they watched their main course make a break for the stratosphere. Children cheered, adults laughed, and the local dogs, confused but ever hopeful, chased after it, barking madly. The runaway meatloaf became the talk of the town and remained a floating legend, occasionally spotted drifting past windows or over trees. Some say it eventually landed in a nearby field, but others insist it found its way to another town, where it was mistaken for a rare atmospheric phenomenon dubbed the flying dinner. This helium madness cemented Wibbleton's reputation as a place where even the sky wasn't a limit for culinary creativity. The townsfolk, emboldened by each other's inventiveness, looked forward to what next year's parade might bring. Perhaps a helium-filled pumpkin pie or a squadron of floating sausages. Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. Wibbleton was now firmly on the map as the floating food capital of the world. Following the helium-high jinx of the Wibbleton parade, the stakes at the next pudding contest were sky-high, quite literally. Competitors, fueled by the success of Bob's buoyant dessert, were determined not just to match his creativity, but to surpass it. The event was teeming with spectators, eager to see just how far up the culinary world could go. Among the ambitious entrants was Miss Fritter, a sweet old lady with a notorious competitive streak and a penchant for puns. She announced that she would be presenting an anti-gravity apple pie. The crowd was abuzz with anticipation. After all, who wouldn't want to see a pie that could defy the very laws of physics? Miss Fritter, dressed in her finest apron adorned with apples and armed with a mysterious-looking gadget she referred to as the floatomatic, began her preparation with a flourish. She promised that her pie wouldn't just float, it would gently hover, offering itself to be eaten right out of the air. However, as the moment of truth approached, it became clear that Miss Fritter might have been too ambitious. With a dramatic countdown and a flick of a switch, the float-o-matic activated. Instead of a gentle hover, the apple pie shot upwards like a rocket, suctioning itself to the ceiling of the contest hall with a comical thwop! The crowd gasped, and then burst into laughter as they watched the pie, a perfectly crusted specimen, cling stubbornly above them. Miss Fritter, flustered but not defeated, grabbed a microphone and declared, "Well, folks, it seems my pie has decided to be a bit more aspirational than expected." Her quick wit drew more laughter and applause from the audience, who admired her spirit. The judges, bemused and entertained, deemed her pie an overhead success. A ladder had to be fetched for the tasting, turning the judging process into a spectacle of its own. Judges climbed up one by one, cautiously taking a bite of the gravity-defying dessert. Each judge's climb was met with cheers and chuckles from the audience, making the tasting session resemble a slapstick comedy routine. The rest of the contest saw a series of similarly ambitious desserts, from floating flans that wobbled precariously at eye level to a gelatin that decided to dance its way across the judging table. Each entry brought its own flavor of chaos to the hall, leaving the audience in stitches and the judges perpetually bewildered but delighted. This pudding contest, marked by floating desserts and culinary capers, secured Wibbleton's reputation as a town where food wasn't just eaten, but thoroughly enjoyed, in every sense of the word. Miss Fritter's pie, still talked about as the dessert that aimed for the stars, set a new benchmark, not just in culinary innovation, but in the sheer joy of baking. The pudding contest in Wibbleton had become a battlefield of buoyancy and balance by the time the next year rolled around, and no one was more determined to reclaim her crown than Mrs. Appleby. Having seen her pudding supremacy challenged by floating pies and levitating loaves, she decided it was time to throw her spoon into the ring with something unprecedented: the balancing custard. Mrs. Appleby, known for her impeccable baking skills and less so for circus acts, unveiled her plan with a flourish that captivated the entire town. She didn't just make a custard, she turned it into a high-wire act, literally. Across the contest hall, she had stretched a tightrope, and upon this, her custard would perform its balancing act. The crowd was buzzing with curiosity. How would a custard, of all things, manage such a feat? On the day of the contest, the hall was packed to the rafters, the air thick with anticipation and the sweet scent of sugar. Mrs. Appleby, dressed in a sequined baker's hat that sparkled under the contest lights, rolled her custard out on a small wheeled platform. The custard itself was contained in a shallow but extraordinarily wide dish that looked suspiciously like a pie tin, retrofitted with a gyroscopic device. With a dramatic gesture, she pushed the custard onto the tightrope. There it sat, wobbling slightly, but maintaining its composure with the dignity of an opera singer during a high note. The audience held their breath, half expecting it to splat dramatically onto the floor. But the custard held firm, a wobbly yellow mass teetering on the brink of potential disaster, yet never falling. The real show began when Mrs. Appleby, ever the showwoman, announced that no custard of hers could be served without a pinch of nutmeg. She then proceeded to tiptoe onto the rope herself, a sprinkle of nutmeg in hand, moving with a grace that belied her years. Each step was met with gasps from the audience as she gingerly approached the balancing custard, sprinkled it with nutmeg, and retreated as cautiously as she had advanced. The judges were not just bewildered, they were thoroughly entertained. The sight of Mrs. Appleby, a venerable figure in Wibbleton's culinary scene, balancing on a tightrope to season her dish, was both hilarious and awe-inspiring. It was clear that she had not only raised the bar for culinary innovation, but had literally walked it. The balancing custard was a hit, not just for its flavor, but for the spectacle it provided. It became the talk of the town, discussed in every corner from the barber shop to the bakery. Mrs. Appleby's performance had added a new layer to the pudding contest, proving that in Wibbleton, cooking was not just about taste, it was about courage, creativity, and a dash of daring. After witnessing Mrs. Appleby's custard tightrope act, Bob was inspired to crank his imagination up several notches. As Mrs. Appleby had delicately balanced her way back into the limelight, Bob, the quintessential dreamer, was already doodling the future of aerial edibles. His workshop was a whirlwind of blueprints and bizarre gadgets, each sketch more outlandish than the last, promising an aerial dessert ballet for the upcoming contest. Bob became a walking teaser trailer for his next big invention, touting a dessert so revolutionary it could join the circus. He envisioned a pudding that didn't just float, but somersaulted, pirouetted, and maybe even did the splits mid-air. The townsfolk of Wibbleton, already well-versed in levitating lunches, were tingling with excitement. Children wagered it might eject confetti or sing show tunes, while adults humorously debated whether they might need Oprah glasses to catch all the action from the ground. Back in his chaotic laboratory, which resembled a cross between a bakery and a mad scientist's lair, Bob was in full inventor mode. His kitchen was alive with the buzz of mixers, the beep of timers, and the occasional pastry zooming by like a misguided missile. Bob, with a protective helmet and a determined grin, would chase after his flying confections, notepad in hand, dodging past a floating eclair or a rogue tart. Finally, the big day arrived, and Bob unveiled his pièce de résistance, the pudding pyrotechnic. This wasn't just any dessert, it was a custard spectacle, rigged with a mechanism that, once triggered, propelled it into a choreographed aerial dance. As the crowd watched, the pudding ascended, then burst into a dazzling display of edible sparkles, flavored like vanilla and tinted with the essence of a dozen summer sunsets. The children squealed with delight, their mouths open to catch the sweet, glittery shower, while adults applauded the innovation, their smartphones out, capturing the aerial acrobatics of a dessert gone wild. The pudding pyrotechnic was more than a hit, it was a viral sensation. Bob scooped up the grand prize with ease, his dessert heralded as a marvel of culinary engineering. Wibbleton's annual pudding contest had evolved from a charming local event into a blockbuster must-see, attracting food enthusiasts from all corners of the globe. As the festivities concluded, the proud residents of Wibbleton revelled in their town's reputation as a hub of gastronomic genius and delightful dottiness. Bob, ever the visionary, was already plotting his next challenge. With a mischievous glint in his eye, he teased about his upcoming project, zero-gravity chocolate cake. "Why settle for the sky when there are stars and beyond?" he quipped, watching a test batch of pudding orbit his backyard like a miniature planetary system. Wibbleton had indeed confirmed that the sky was no longer the limit, but just the beginning. From floating desserts to dessert constellations, the town had carved out its niche in pushing culinary boundaries to new, joyous extremes. Every meal in Wibbleton was an escapade, every dessert a pioneer, proving once and for all that the most enchanting creations often spring from the silliest, sweetest ideas. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting Wibbleton in hues of orange and pink, the town square buzzed with the excitement of a day well spent. Children, still giggling from the aerial antics of the pudding pyrotechnic, chased each other with remnants of helium-filled treats, their laughter echoing through the streets. Bob, now surrounded by a crowd of eager fans and budding inventors, held court near his now famous pudding booth. He regaled them with tales of past inventions that didn't quite hit the mark, his voice filled with infectious enthusiasm. "And remember," he said, raising a spoon dramatically into the air, "if at first you don't succeed, it's just an opportunity to make a bigger, tastier explosion next time." The crowd erupted in laughter, and even Mr. Grumble, who had just arrived to ensure that no more desserts were parked illegally, couldn't help but crack a smile. Just then, a slight commotion at the edge of the square drew their attention. Mrs. Appleby, her apron still dusted with flour, was marching towards Bob, dragging something large and covered with a tartan blanket behind her. "Bob, your pudding might fly, but wait till you see what I've got planned for next year," she declared, unveiling a gigantic spring-loaded pie launcher. "Next year, we're not just going sky-high, we're aiming for pie in the sky." Laughter filled the air as Bob clapped his hands in delight, and the townsfolk gathered around to discuss potential pie-filling aerodynamics. The children, not to be outdone, began sketching their own versions of flying desserts. As the evening wound down and the last of the helium balloons drifted lazily into the twilight, the moral of the story became clear to everyone in Wibbleton. In a world bound by gravity and rules, sometimes the sweetest victories come from letting your imagination soar. And in Wibbleton, it seemed the best way to reach for the stars was with a spoon in one hand and a pie, or pudding, in the other.